His debut nonfiction book, How the Word is Passed, is still available for pre order. And I don't think I've ever been this excited or nervous, quite honestly, to introduce someone. Um, Clint Smith is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he shares morally urgent writing. His essays, poems, and scholarly writing have been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, sorry, the New Republic, Poetry Magazine, the Paris Review, and the Harvard Educational Review. His first full length collection of poetry, Counting Dissent, won multiple awards. Previously, Clint taught high school English right here in PG County, Maryland. Clint received his BA in English from Davidson College and his PhD in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Orleans, he currently lives here in Maryland with his wife and their 2 children. Clint, thank you so much for joining us.
It is an honor and a pleasure. I am so happy to be here with you all this evening. As I mentioned, I have a 3.5-year-old and a 2-year-old, or almost 2-year-old. And so these have been fascinating and strange times. I think, like many of you, we have gone through the sort of wild ride of the last 11 months of, having childcare and then not having childcare. And my wife and I both work. And so splitting the days, half day, you know, children Zoom bombing into all your meetings, having to, do bath time with one hand and, manage an office in my wife's case with one hand, or try to submit a piece with the other. It's been, nothing, none of us could have imagined this. And so I think I just want to name, before, I've never talked to a group of preschool parents before. I have to say this is my first experience on that front. But I feel as if I'm one of you, because I am one of you in so many ways. And I used to live in Tacoma Park. And so we moved here to I now live in Silver Spring, so not too far down the road. But Tacoma is a place that is near and dear to my heart. I miss the farmers market. I miss the bus boys being right down the street. I miss it all. But I'm honored and happy that you all have asked me to come spend some time with you today. And this is it's going to be a different sort of talk. I'm not sure what sort of talks and speakers you all have had before, but I'm less interested in kind of like talking at you, and I don't really use any PowerPoints or anything like that. As was mentioned, I'm a writer, I'm a poet, and I think it is what's most helpful for me in sort of grounding this conversation is using poetry as the means of sort of entering the conversation. And so I'm going to share some poems that sort of anchor my talk throughout. And what those are meant to do is serve as a sort of invitation for you all, in the way that poetry has so often served as an invitation for me. I think that poems and writing and literature at its best is something that both serves as a mirror in terms of providing someone with the opportunity to see themselves or hear themselves or imagine themselves in a text that they previously hadn't seen. And it also allows for the opportunity for a sort of radical empathy, right? This opportunity to walk in somebody's shoes and experience the world through somebody's eyes that are fundamentally different than ours. I mean, some of my favorite novels and my favorite writing and favorite poems in the world are things that have nothing to do with me or my own experiences. So many are, but others aren't. I think June Lahiri is one of my favorite writers in the world, and I'm not an Indian immigrant. I don't have any immigrants in my family. Mohsin Hamid, who wrote one of the best books of the last several years, in Exit West. I'm not a Middle Eastern. I'm not, but my point is that so many of these books were and continue to be transformative for me because they invite me into a set of experiences that are not my own, but that are at once so remarkably universal. And the first poem I ever heard was by a woman who had cerebral palsy. And I remember leaving the open mic that night. This was in New York City. And in 3 minutes, the way I thought about an entire demographic of people had like completely changed and completely shifted. I never thought about disability the same way again after leaving that event where I heard that woman share her poem. And that was what sort of drew me into this space. And I was like, I don't know what this is, but I want to do that. And so all that's to say, thank you all for inviting me, and hopefully this will serve as an invitation of sorts for you all. So this is also an interesting moment because typically I would, drive my Subaru down the road and meet you all. I guess I would hope that I would be able to see you all in person, and we would be able to share space. And there's something so, if we didn't know how special it was before, we certainly know how special those sorts of moments are now. And you also create a sort of intimacy and energy in doing so. But part of what you have to do in this context is like figure out new ways and different ways to replicate that energy. So, typically when people go to a poetry reading, we think you're supposed to sit there and be polite, and you're just supposed to be like, or and then you do a polite little golf clap at the end. That's whack. We don't do that here. That's no fun. If you like something, I want to see you snap. You got to snap on the screen. Go ahead, give it a try. If you really, really like something, we say, I'm going to put it on gallery mode so I can see you all. If you really, really like something, we say you do the delicious chocolate noise. And that's when you go, You'll be on mute, so I won't hear you, but I can feel it. It will ooze through the screen. If you really, really like someone which just moves you, you feel it viscerally in your chest. We say you do Jesus, but with a sh, because it's the secular space. So it's like, Jesus, and you fall over on the person next to you. Please only fall on people next to you if they give you permission, if they're in your bubble. You could fall out of the screen. You could just fall back, grab your dog, throw it in the air. Don't throw your baby in the air. And you can also use the chat. You can also use the emojis, just to the reaction emojis. Just to create some semblance of community, and to make sure that we all know that we are here together. So I always tell people, when I'm going to be talking a lot about what I think about and write about is in part the sort of history of inequality, and the way that racism and the history of racism has shaped what our contemporary landscape of inequality looks like. And before I do that, part of what I think is important is to situate myself and my own life within that sort of larger systemic and structural context. I was trained in graduate school by sociologists, and they always talk about this idea of positionality, which means like if you are going to talk about or research a subject matter, if you are going to be honest about it, you have to consider the ways in which the different facets of your identity shape how your research, how you navigate that research, and how you approach the research. And so this first poem is sort of situating myself in the sort of context of this ecosystem of systemic racism, before we get into a sort of more historical deep dive. And so for context, I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, was raised in a very mixed race, mixed income community, went to a very mixed race, mixed income school, had Black friends, white friends, Asian friends. It was like the Disney Channel. It was great. We were riding our bikes, theme music playing in the background. Our hair was blowing in the wind. It's clearly their hair, not my hair. And my dad would always say, he's like, I love that you are such a diverse group of friends. That's why we sent you to the school. That's why we moved to this neighborhood. But you have to understand that the implications for the decisions that you make might be very different for you than they are for your other friends. And when you're a kid, you don't understand that. When you're a kid, you're just like, you're the mean dad. You're the strict dad. Why can't you be more like Tommy's dad? And he's like, Tommy don't live in this house. And then he walked away very dramatically because he's watched far too many Denzel Washington movies, which is, a conversation for another time. Like, Dad, we're in a restaurant. Why are you trying to walk in slow motion? Please stop. You're embarrassing all of us. And it wasn't until Tamir Rice was killed, the 12-year-old boy, many of us know, who's killed in Cleveland, Ohio, several years ago, shot while playing with a toy gun in a park in an open carry state. Police shot him within 2 seconds of them pulling up to the scene. So obviously multiple layers of issues to that case. And it was in that moment in which the sort of youthful abstraction of the fear that my parents had for myself and my siblings became more fully concretized, right? Like I heard the interview that Tamir Rice's mother did, where she told him how careful he needed to be, where she told him not to play with that gun outside, where she told him over and over again, gave him the warnings that so many Black parents instill and give to their children. Uh, and I thought about how this was the sort of most lethal manifestation of the fear that my own parents carried. And I thought about how, you know, but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, what happened to Tamir Rice could have happened to me. It could have happened to so many people I know. And I thought about the sort of intergenerational nature of the talk that Black parents have with their children, that Black teachers have with their children, that people who work with Black young people often try to communicate to them, which is, you know, how my grandfather had a certain conversation with my father had a certain conversation with me, and I will one day have to have a certain conversation with my own son, right, who right now is 3 years old and loves pizza and pineapples and the Pachycephalosaurus. And I've learned so many dinosaurs over quarantine. It's like I didn't know there were so many. And who, you know, when we walk through the park or when we walk through the grocery store, people are like, oh, he's so adorable. He's so cute. What a wonderful boy. And knowing that that will end for him far sooner than it will for some of his friends, far sooner than it will for his non-Black counterparts. And thinking about the social science research behind the process of what sociologists call adultification, in which young Black children, both boys and girls, are seen as being more grown or seen as being older, and thus more of a threat and thus more dangerous than their non-Black counterparts. And that is a sort of rationale that is used over and over again by police when we see these things happen. It was like when they saw Tamir Rice, they said they thought he was an 18-year-old man. When they saw, you know, these other different examples of young Black men, they always talk about how they thought they were so much older than they actually ended up being in many cases. And so all that's to say, I think a lot about that conversation and the tension between wanting to communicate, you know, what my father and my mother had that conversation with me, and how they were navigating a tension of wanting to communicate to me the realities of the world while also attempting to make me understand that it wasn't my fault, right? And that's the difficulty, is like, how do you keep a young person safe and make sure that they're aware of the very real social, historical, and political circumstances that might create a threat to their bodies, but also still let them be a child, right? Also not paralyze them with a sense of fear. And how do you do both? And that's something I think about with my own children now, is like, how do you communicate those things to my son? My son is now, he's, you know, there's so many moments where, you know, we'll hear a police car and he'll be like, well, like, what is a police officer? Like, what do they do? And like, how do you communicate to a 3-year-old? And what are the ways to have those conversations in ways that are both age appropriate, but also preparing a young person for a very real set of realities, so that they don't move through the world with this sort of naivete or lack of preparedness. And it's difficult, and you quickly learn that one doesn't know, doesn't always know how to frame it, but you kind of just do your best every time. So all that's to say, here's the first poem, which is thinking about, which I wrote after Tamir Rice was killed, and it's kind of attempting to put my own life in conversation with what happened to him. One night when I was 12 years old, on an overnight field trip someplace I can't remember, my friends and I bought super soakers, turned the hotel parking lot into our own water-filled battle zone. We hid behind cars, running through the darkness that lay between the streetlights. Boundless laughter ubiquitous across the pavement. For within 10 minutes, my father came outside, grabbed me by my forearm, and led me into our room with an unfamiliar grip. Before I could say anything, tell him how foolish having to look in front of my friends, he derided me for being so naive. Looked me in the eye, fear consuming his face, and said, son, I'm sorry, but you can't act the same as your white friends. You can't pretend to shoot guns. You can't run around in the dark. You can't hide behind anything other than your own teeth. I know now how scared he must have been, how easily I could have fallen into the empty of the night, that some man will mistake this water for a good reason to wash all of this away. These are the sorts of messages I was inundated with my entire life, Always keep your hands so they can see them. Don't move too quickly. Take off your hood when the sun goes down. My parents raised me and my siblings in an armor of advice, an ocean of alarm bells so someone wouldn't steal the breath from our lungs, so that they wouldn't make a memory of this skin, so we could be kids, not casket or concrete. And it's not because they thought it would make us better than anyone else. It's simply because they wanted to keep us alive. All of my Black friends were raised with the same message. The talk given to us when we became old enough to be mistaken for a nail ready to be hammered to the ground, when people made our melanin synonymous with something to be feared. But what does it do to a child to grow up knowing that you cannot simply be a child, that the whims of adolescence are too dangerous for your breath? You cannot simply be curious. You are not afforded the luxury of making a mistake, that someone's implicit bias might be the reason you don't wake up in the morning. But this cannot be what defines us, because we had parents who raised us to understand that our bodies weren't meant for the backside of a bullet, but for flying kites and jumping rope and laughing until our stomachs burst. We had teachers who taught us how to raise our hands in class and not just to signal surrender, and that the only thing we should give up is the idea that we aren't worthy of this world. So when we say that Black lives matter, it's not because others don't. It's simply because we must affirm that we are worthy of existing without fear, when there are so many things that tell us we are not. I want to live in a world where my son will not be presumed guilty the moment he is born, where a toy in his hand isn't mistaken for anything other than a toy. And I refuse to accept that we can't build this world into something new, someplace where a child's name doesn't have to be written on a t-shirt or a tombstone, where the value of someone's life isn't determined by anything other than the fact that they had lungs. A place where every single one of us can breathe. And that's that poem. There we go. There we go. If we were in person, what I would tell you is that nobody snaps after a poem. That's not, if you snap after the poem, it's like a weird 90s R&B video vibe. And like, that's great. That's also not the vibe we're going for. But like something about like clapping on a screen feels like much more intense than snapping. So for this context, snapping, it creates this sort of lovely gallery of movement, which I like. So that's very kind of you all. So when we have these conversations about race and racism, the problem is that so often people think about these things in an interpersonal context. And people don't sort of, will have something like what happened this summer. And people will try to understand racism as being an interpersonal phenomenon that is consists of hate and slurs and what is in somebody's heart. And luckily, I think we're in a place which is very different than when the Black Lives Matter movement started, in which many more people have a much more sophisticated understanding of what racism is and how it manifests itself. And I think, if I think about the conversations that folks were having at the beginning when, Trayvon Martin was killed in, 2013, 2012, 2013. I think 2012, and then the trial was in 2013, even when Mike Brown was killed in 2014. If you said, what is redlining to somebody in 2014, people would have been like, is it a brand of makeup? Like what, it just wasn't, and many people still don't know, to be clear, but it also is much more a part of our public discourse in ways that I think are helpful. And so I always give this timeline because I think it's really important to sort of ground us in the historical context of the conversation. But the first enslaved Black people came to the country that would become the United States in 1619. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, Civil War ended in 1865, Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were signed in 1964 and 1965, and the Federal Housing Act was signed in 1968. So it's only been about 50 years in which Black people in this country have even had a semblance of legal and legislative freedom. For 350 years prior to that, it was fundamentally legal to discriminate against, dehumanize, delegitimize, and disenfranchise Black people. Not in an interpersonal, somebody being mean and using the N-word, but like you are a state-sanctioned second-class citizen if you're to be considered a citizen at all. So if you were to kick somebody for 350 years, and then ostensibly stop kicking them for a seventh of the amount of time that you spent kicking them, it would be both morally and intellectually disingenuous to then look at that group of people and be like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you get the same academic outcomes? Why don't you get the same economic outcomes? Why is there so much violence and poverty saturating your community when we know the answers to these questions, right? And so, I've spent the last 3 years working on a book about the history of slavery in the country, how the word is passed, and how it is remembered and how it is documented at different places across the country: plantations, prisons, cemeteries, monuments, memorials, cities, neighborhoods, towns. And it comes out in June. And I've been thinking a lot about the ways that folks really failed to understand the extent to which, one, how central slavery was to the United States existing and becoming a global economic superpower, right? We talk about how Yale professor David Blight talks about how in 1860, the 4 million enslaved Black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined. Or we can talk about how my grandfather's grandfather and my grandmother's grandmother were both born into slavery, right? We're born into bondage. So there'll be these moments where my child will be sitting on my grandfather's lap. And I imagine a scenario in which my grandfather is sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm reminded that this thing that we tell ourselves happened a long time ago wasn't in fact that long ago at all. That the woman who rang the bell next to the Obama family at the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture was the daughter of an enslaved person, right? And she just passed away. The last remaining Civil War widow who was receiving a pension just passed away a few weeks ago, right? So this thing that we have convinced ourselves because of our textbooks, because of black and white, film and documentary footage was eons ago, was in fact not that long ago at all, and plays a real role in shaping what the landscape of inequality looks like today. And I think it's really helpful. One of the places I went was Monticello Plantation. And Monticello, for those who aren't familiar, is where Thomas Jefferson lived when he wasn't engaged in public service, when he wasn't in the cabinet, or when he wasn't president, or when he wasn't abroad. And Monticello is a fascinating place for me because I think it represents and sort of embodies and is a microcosm. I think Jefferson and Monticello are both microcosms of a sort of larger story of America, one in which we are often so committed to the idea of American exceptionalism that we suppress or sidestep any story that makes us look unexceptional. And, the truth of it is that Thomas Jefferson, was the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence. As I was taught, think about the way that I was taught about Thomas Jefferson in my K-12 education, that he is the intellectual founding father of this country. He drafted the Declaration of Independence, helped James Madison write the Constitution. He represents the best of our American ideals, the best of our aspirations. He laid these sort of political and intellectual framework and bedrock upon which the American project would be built. And what I never learned is what I would later read in Notes on the State of Virginia, which is his sort of memoir, his manifesto of sorts, which he writes about a range of subjects. And in it, he theorizes pretty explicitly. He's like, Black people are inherently inferior to white people in, quote, in both endowments of body and mind. He said, the slave is incapable of love. The slave is incapable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion. He writes about Phillis Wheatley, who's considered to be the first published Black poet in the history of the United States. He's like, well, Black people don't really possess the emotional or intellectual acumen with which to create art. So we can call this something else, but we shouldn't call it poetry because Black people don't possess the emotional capacity with which to create beautiful things. He said that, quote, her work was beneath the dignity of criticism, that Black people can't experience love, and love is necessary to create poetry. And so Black people are unable to create art in that way. And I think about that, and I think about how that's a version of Jefferson that I was never taught. I think about how important it is and how much of a missed opportunity it is to give young people and give ourselves a fuller understanding of what America has been and what America is if we tell the whole story about those things rather than just a piece of it, right? That Jefferson was a brilliant man and that he was also deeply racist, that he is the person who drafted one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and that he enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, that he was the person who had the political and philosophical principles and acumen that were necessary to help build this democracy and this republic, and that he enslaved 4 of his own children that he had by an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings, right? Like all of those things are part of who Jefferson is. And the problem is that so often we only tell a part of that story and have only told a part of that story because it's convenient for the sort of narrative we like to tell about America. And we don't reckon with the fact that, like, in order to understand what America is, we have to better understand the people who wrote the documents and created the social contract that we have all been born into, or born into or brought into. And that feels really important to me. So at Monticello, which is the first chapter of the book, I spend a lot of time thinking about how this institution communicates and conveys the who Jefferson, how do you hold that sort of complicated duality? And in some ways, it's not even a duality; it's like an entangled self. How do you hold the contradictions of Jefferson together, and thus hold the contradictions of America together, and recognize that America is a place where that has provided millions and millions of people with untold, unparalleled opportunities that have changed the trajectory of their families' lives across generations, and also that it is a place that has allowed for that to happen at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been systemically oppressed across generations, right? And that both of those things are America. And both of those parts of Jefferson are Jefferson. And both of those parts of Monticello are Jefferson, are Monticello. And I think in order to more fully understand who we are and how we arrived here, we have to tell a fuller story, I think, of who we've been. So what we know is that 12 of our first 18 presidents owned enslaved people. 8 of them owned slaves while they were in office. And this poem is a letter to 5 of them. Letter to 5 of the presidents who owned slaves while they were in office. George Washington, when you won the revolution, how many of your soldiers did you send from the battlefield to the cotton field? How many had to trade in their rifles for plows? Can you blame the slaves who ran away to fight for the British? Because at least the redcoats were honest about their oppression. Thomas Jefferson, when you told Sally Hemings that you would free her children if she remained your mistress, did you think there was honor in your ultimatum? Did you think we wouldn't be able to recognize the assault in your signature as raping your slave when you disguise it as bribery, make it less of a crime? When you wrote the Declaration of Independence, did you ever intend for Black people to have freedom over their bodies? James Madison, when you wrote to Congress that Black people should count as 3/5 of a person, how long did you have to look at your slaves to figure out the math? Was it easy to chop them up? Did you think they'd be happy being more than just half human? James Monroe, when you proposed sending slaves back to Africa, did Black bodies feel like rented tools? When you branded them, did the scar on their chest include an expiration date? When you named the country Liberia, were you trying to be ironic? Does this really count as liberation? Andrew Jackson, was the Trail of Tears not enough for you? Was killing Cherokee, Choctaw, Creeks, Seminoles not enough to quench your imperialism? How many brown bodies do you have to bulldoze before you can call it progress, Mr. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson? When you put your hand on the Bible and swore to protect this country, let's be honest in who you were talking about. When the first Independence Day fireworks set the sky aflame, don't forget where we were watching from. So when you remember Jefferson's genius, don't forget the slaves who built the bookshelves in his library. When you remember Jackson's victories in war, don't forget what he was fighting to preserve. When you sing that this country was founded on freedom, don't forget the duet of shackles dragging against the ground my entire life. I've been taught how perfect this country was, but no one ever told me about the pages torn out of my textbooks, how Black and brown bodies have been bludgeoned for 3 centuries and find no place in the curriculum. Oppression doesn't disappear just because you decided not to teach us that chapter. If you only hear one side of the story, at some point you have to question who the writer is. And that's that poem. And so one of the other places that I go in the book is Angola prison. And Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the country, 18,000 acres wide on the border of, or 18,000 acres. It is 18,000 acres, contains 18,000 acres, and which is larger than the island of Manhattan. And it is on the border. It is in Louisiana, but on the border between Louisiana and Mississippi. And I went there, and part of what's interesting to me, what I always tell people is that, you know, it is the largest maximum security prison in the country, and has 90% of the people held there, or 75% of the people held there are Black men, and 70% are serving life sentences. And it's built on top of a former plantation. What I tell people is that if you were to go to Germany, and in Germany, the largest maximum security prison in Germany was built on top of a former concentration camp in which 75% of the current occupants were Jewish, it would be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be an affront to our ethical and moral sensibilities. It would be abhorrent. We would never truly allow such a place to exist. And if it did exist, people would be protesting outside of it every day because it would be the most horrific physical embodiment of anti-Semitism that one could imagine. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country, built on top of a former plantation in which the vast majority of people held there are Black men serving life sentences who go out into fields and work for between 2 and 20 cents an hour, picking vegetables and beans and until very recently cotton. And it's kind of like, it's not even something that people don't know. Some people don't know. A lot of people know it. And it's like one of the first things that's mentioned in any article about Angola. Angola is a former plantation. But what is it that allows us to let a place like that to continue to exist? And what are the ways that white supremacy not only enacts violence against people's bodies, but also numbs us collectively to certain types of violence that should otherwise be wildly unacceptable? Like, why does Angola get to exist? And why does it get to exist there, in that space, in that context? And so, you know, another place that I go in the book is the Blandford Cemetery in Petersburg, Virginia, which is one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country. The remains of 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried there. And I went during the Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration, which, and as you can imagine, I was a conspicuous presence at such an event. But it really was fascinating to go there and understand the sort of contemporary manifestations of the lost cause, and to understand the ways that so many people don't care about historical evidence, no matter what historical evidence or empirical evidence you show someone, if it serves as a threat to their sense of their lineage, their sense of who they are in the world, then they will be unwilling to accept it, many of them. And that's what I found. I found that so many of the people there lived a mythology about the Civil War, about the South, about the Confederacy, about what it means, what it stands for, what their ancestors who fought for that cause, what they were fighting for. And it, you know, what's true is that all you have to do to understand what the Confederacy stood for and what it was about is look at the declarations of Confederate secession that they signed in 1861 during all of these secession conventions they had, in which they named quite explicitly why they were seceding from the Union. You could take Mississippi, for example. Mississippi in 1861 wrote that, quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material good in the history of the world," right? So like they were not opaque about like why they were seceding from the Union and ultimately why they would go to war. But it is another reflection of the failure of the success of the lost cause, is that so many people, even well-meaning people, even people who don't subscribe to the sort of ideological contours of people like who I met in the Sons of Confederate Veterans, you know, a Southern Poverty Law Center in 2018 found that only 8% of US high school seniors were able to identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War, right? 8. And so the cause has been successful in sort of blurring the water and blurring the picture. And that is, you know, we see a sort of manifestation that, I mean, we've seen different manifestations and iterations of that over the last several years, the last 4 or 5 years, most specifically. And we saw a culmination of that last week in many ways. And I think I wrote a piece for The Atlantic about this photo that I had seen of the man who was carrying the Confederate flag through the US Capitol, and how that flag is now forever tied to this event, and the flag in the same way that it was tied to the seceding nation that fought a war predicated on maintaining the institution of slavery, the same way that it was tied to the re-emergence of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, and then later in the 1950s, and the way that that flag was present at the Ku Klux Klan marches, the way it was present when they were attempting to intimidate young Black children who were integrating schools in the South, and now the way that an insurrectionist mob, violently entered the U.S. Capitol, and that is the flag and image we will remember. All that's to say, part of what I'm trying to do in the book is go to these places to make sense of like what places are reckoning with it and what places are failing to, and it's a sort of range of places there. But in order to understand inequality in this country, you don't have to only understand slavery. You can just look to the 20th century, and something that well, before that, let me say that I grew up in New Orleans, as I mentioned, and the other piece of the thing that I explore in the book is the Confederate monuments and the conversation we have about the Confederate monuments and what they are and what they stood for. And so I'll read this poem first before I move on to the 20th century, which is the poem that sort of served as a catalyst for the book project. The book, my first book, collection of book. My first book was you guys are the first people that I'll be able to show both to. So my first book was a collection of poetry, Counting Descent, came out in 2016. And my forthcoming book is this book. And I've never done this before. Look at my two other children. These ones stay quiet though. They don't get out of bed. But this poetry is how I came into writing. It's still the sort of soul of my writing in many ways. And at first I thought that I would write a collection of poetry about Confederate monuments, and but then ultimately decided that this book would be best served as a nonfiction book. And so it's a narrative nonfiction book that goes to all of these places. And this poem was the first thing I wrote that sort of served as the entry point to what became the larger project. Growing up, the iconography of the Confederacy was an ever-present fixture of my daily life. Every day on the way to school, I passed a statue of PGT Beauregard riding on horseback, his Confederate uniform slung over his shoulder, and his military cap pulled far down over his eyes. As a child, I did not know who PGT Beauregard was. I did not know he was the man who ordered the first attack that opened the Civil War. I did not know he was one of the architects who designed the Confederate national flag. I did not know he led an army predicated on maintaining the institution of slavery. What I knew is that he looked like so many of the other statues that ornamented the edges of this city, these copper garlands of a past that saw truth as something that should be buried underground and silenced by the soil. After the war, the sons and daughters of the Confederacy reshaped the contours of treason into something they could name as honorable. They called it the lost cause, and it crept its way into textbooks that attempted to cover up a crime that was still unfolding. They told us that Robert E. Lee was an honest man, guilty of nothing but fighting for the state and the people that he loved, that the Southern flag was about heritage and remembering those slain fighting to preserve their way of life. But see, the thing about the lost cause is that it's only lost if you're not actually looking. The thing about heritage is that it's a word that also means I'm ignoring what we did to you. I was taught the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but I was never taught how the declarations of Confederate secession had the promise of human bondage carved into its stone. I was never taught how the declarations of Confederate secession had the promise of human bondage carved into its stone. I was taught how the war was about economics, but I was never taught that in 1860, the 4 million enslaved Black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined. I was taught that the Civil War was about states' rights, but I was never taught how the Fugitive Slave Act could care less about a border and spell Georgia and Massachusetts the exact same way. It's easy to look at a flag and call it heritage when you don't see the Black bodies buried behind it. It's easy to look at a statue and call it history when you ignore the laws written in its wake. I come from a city abounding with statues of white men on pedestals and Black children playing beneath them, where we played trumpets and trombones to drown out the Dixie song that still whistled in the wind. In New Orleans, there are over 100 schools, roads, and buildings named for Confederates and slaveholders. Every day, Black children walk into buildings named after people who didn't want them to be there. Every time I return home, I drive on streets named for those who didn't think of me as human, who thought of me in chains. Go straight for 2 miles on Robert E. Lee, take a left on Jefferson Davis, make the first right on Claiborne. Translation, go straight for 2 miles on the general who slaughtered hundreds of black soldiers who were trying to surrender. Take a left on the president of the Confederacy who understood the torture of black bodies as the cornerstone of his new nation. Make the first right of the man who, on the man who permitted the heads of rebelling slaves to be put on stakes and spread across the city in order to prevent the others from getting any ideas. What name is there for this sort of violence? What do you call it when the road you walk on is named for those who imagined you under a noose? What do you call it when the roof over your head is named after the people who would have wanted the bricks to crush you? And that's that poem. And so, like I said, we don't just have to stay in the 17th, 18th, 19th century in order to understand how racism shapes our current landscape of inequality. Where is that? Here we go. I think a lot about the New Deal. The New Deal is, as I was taught, the single great, most important, or the most important series of progressive legislative acts signed in the 20th century. They are responsible for creating the contemporary middle class. They are the thing that sort of catapulted millions and millions of people into intergenerational opportunity and wealth who otherwise wouldn't have had it. And that is true. What's also true is that, and what I learned from a historian and political scientist named Ira Katz-Nelson, who wrote this fantastic book, Fear Itself, which I can't recommend highly enough. He wrote another book called When Affirmative Action Was White, which is a sort of abridged version of this. And part of what Katz-Nelson talks about is the way that Black people, and specifically Black people in the South, which is where the vast majority of Black people lived in the early 20th century, were specifically left out from having access to the benefits that the New Deal afforded. So Black people didn't have access to Social Security, minimum wage protection, housing mortgages, healthcare, the GI Bill, so many of the things, union membership, so many of the things that were the bedrock upon which intergenerational wealth was built. Black people didn't have access to them, and you didn't have to say, I'm not going to give it to Black people. All you had to say was, I'm not going to give it to farm workers and domestic workers, knowing that 75% of farm workers and domestic workers in the South were Black people. And so that is the sort of insidiousness through which public policy has prevented Black people from having access to these resources. And part of what happens then is generations later, people want to act surprised generations later when there are disparate outcomes along the lines that certain resources have been allotted. But if you give the single greatest catalyst of intergenerational wealth to one group of people, and you very intentionally don't give it to another group of people, you shouldn't be surprised when there are different outcomes across generations moving forward. And so I think about that a lot, and I think that that's another example of the way that would manifest itself in the 20th century, and obviously we continue to have a myriad of ways in which it manifests itself in the 21st. So where are we on time? I'm gonna make this the last poem. Actually, I'm gonna do this, and then I'm gonna do one more poem, and then we'll move to Q&A, because I would love to hear from you all. In 1932, the Great Depression had taken America by the throat and rendered it an alchemy of dust and rations. The country had been decimated by a market that could no longer hold up a history of hypocrisy, and it crashed like something that has never before known what it meant to fall. In response, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed a series of legislative acts designed to lift the country from its knees. The laws transformed the economy and are responsible for the foundation that created the contemporary middle class. In the 1930s, 75% of Southern Black folks were either maids or farm workers. In the 1930s, the only workers who didn't qualify for the benefits of the New Deal were maids and farm workers. I was told you can only call something a coincidence if it wasn't done on purpose. A coincidence is texting with a friend and then running into them at the grocery store. A coincidence is showing up to the office in the same new shirt as your coworker. A coincidence is walking past a vending machine and finding some quarters in your pocket. Taking away all federal benefits from an entire demographic of people feels like we should call it something different, something a little more honest, something a little more empirically grounded. But see, the thing about racism in America is that if you don't call it racism, people think it isn't there. It's the shadow no one can see when it is standing right behind you. It's the carbon monoxide killing you in a room where there is no smoke. 1 million Black folks end up in prison and people shrug and ask what happened. An unarmed man is shot by police when he is running in the opposite direction and people call it self-defense. Interstate highways are built through Black communities and people suddenly can't explain why all the businesses have failed. If you take away Social Security, minimum wage protection, housing, mortgages, and healthcare, You don't get to then turn around, see poverty, and act like you're surprised. How can you take the water from a fish tank and not expect the fish to suffocate, to gasp for its life, to flap violently against the surface while you watch from the other side of the glass? When a fish dies from having no water, do we call that a coincidence? If you block the sun from reaching a tree, do you have to ask why it doesn't grow? The government won't give you a loan to buy a house in a better neighborhood than they blame you when your son gets shot. The city never built a hospital on your side of town, then they tell you it's your fault that the cancer spread. They stuff you into public housing, then tear it down and ask why all the schools are empty. If we didn't say it directly, you can't blame us when it happens. If we continue to keep our eyes shut, it can't be our fault that we don't see you. But see, this country is only able to whisper the words American exceptionalism because we're so good at covering our ears while someone else is screaming. That's that one. I'm gonna do one more. Let's see. I want to change it up, given my audience. So my next collection of poetry should be out in, what's this, 2021, 2022, maybe. 2020, who knows, 2023. No, not 2023, that's too far. It's basically a collection of dad poems. And it's just like, I started writing it when my first child was born, and just kind of like almost as a diary of sorts, to continue to remember and process like these different stages of life, and how both at once it is the single most remarkable thing I've ever experienced, and how I'm tired all the time, right? And that, like, we talk about dualities with Jefferson, dualities with like my lovely, lovely children, who I just want you to sleep through the night till 7, maybe, on a magic, wonderful day. And so the poems take on a range of different tones. Man, I haven't read any of these in a while. Let's see. All right, I'll read one of my dad poems, and then we'll just take it from there. This one's fun. The Great Escape. The first time we bought a baby monitor, I was reluctant to set it up. With all the stories of how the government is watching us through our laptops, listening to us through our Alexas, and tracking us through our phones, the last thing I thought we needed was to bring another means of surveillance into our home. Ultimately, I relented, if for no other reason than to mitigate my fear that you might somehow fall out of your crib. Every night I put you down, turning the bedtime routine into a Broadway musical that would make Lin-Manuel Miranda look on in Hamilton-inspired awe. I mean, we got the bath time song, the toothbrush song, the pajama song, the no you cannot have any more Ritz crackers song, the please do not reach down and touch your poop while I am changing you song. You know, all the classics. And even after my ballads, after I kissed your head and cupped your cheeks, each night I watch you from the baby monitor attempt an elaborate escape effort. You think you're slick, but I see you. Each time I leave the room and turn off the light, you immediately turn to your sinister co-conspirators, Leo the lion and Pork Chop the puppy, to devise a plan of how to escape the crib and forge a path to freedom. Your mother and I watch on the small black and white screen from the kitchen downstairs as the three of you huddle in the corner of the crib to concoct the evening's plans. Somehow, you also got access to my Spotify account and turned on the James Bond theme music just to add to the effect. There was the time you stripped off your bedsheet, tied it together, handed it off to Leo, and asked him to hold one end of the knotted sheet while you used the other to descend down the side of the crib. It is unclear how much this had been thought out, and Leo understandably looked terrified, but fortunately for him, your thumb and index finger dexterity has not yet reached its maximum capacity, so you weren't able to tie the knots in the first place. There was the time you realized that we could see you through the monitor, so you stared right into the camera, narrowed your eyes, and lift Pork Chop over your head, howling an indiscernible cry toward the heavens, and threw the stuffed puppy out of the crib toward the monitor, a sacrifice it seemed unclear that Pork Chop himself was willing to make as his floppy ears somersaulted across the room. You missed the camera completely, as you are a toddler with poor aim and little hand-eye coordination, but it quickly became clear that you had not developed an alternative plan, as Leo crawled to the corner of the crib, hoping that he would not be your next aerial sacrifice. And then there was the time you put Leo and Pork Chop on top of one another and placed them in the crib of a bright, and placed them in a pair of bright red and green pajamas in the crib, trying to get me to think that your stuffed animals dressed in Hannah Anderson jammies were in fact you. As I looked into your crib, I heard you snicker on the other side of the room behind a copy of Goodnight Moon. Somehow, maybe by your laughter or by the sound of your gas, I figured that it was not you in the crib, but I will say I appreciate the hustle. I know Cheerios are downstairs and fruit pouches are in the fridge, but fam, sacrificing your stuffed animals is not the way to get them. That's my dad poem for the evening. All right. I don't know how we want to do the sort of Q&A session, but it's up to you all. I don't know how you all usually do it.
Well, I think we kind of do it. We just do it. You can use the chat if you feel more comfortable, or you can unmute yourself and talk.
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it.
I should also say that this book is available for pre-order now. I know that you all have gotten, or some copies have been purchased, but if you're interested in getting more copies for your friends and family, it's deeply appreciated, makes a big difference for writers. That's how sort of momentum of the book continues to build. So your support is appreciated if you feel so inclined.
I'd like to say something if it's okay. I hope I'm not cutting somebody off. So I'm Heidi. I'm an alumni and I also work for the school. But first, I want to know every single book that's behind you. I've been trying to look at all those titles and like, ooh, what are those? But also just to hear you read your poems, it's such a different experience. I mean, I haven't read your poems yet, but when I do, I'm so glad now that the very first time I've been introduced to a Clint Smith poem, it's your voice. And so when I read them now, I'm going to have your voice in my head. And you have to know that you have a beautiful way of speaking, and your diction and the way that you rap. I mean, it was almost like rapping. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to ask a question. I wanted to ask about your writing process. When you write your poems, do you write like little ideas first and then develop them into poems? Do you write by hand, or do you think on the computer? Is it different depending on the subject matter? The dad poems versus some of the other work that you shared with us. I'm just really interested in the process, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there was the pre-kids process, and then there was the after-kids process. I think I used to have my water. Like, I used to get up, and I used to go on a run, and then I used to come back, and I used to shower, and I'd have my tea in the corner, and I would have my books here, and I was ready. None of that exists anymore. It truly is so much of I wrote my book and my dissertation at the same time, which I don't recommend, and I wouldn't do again, but what's done is done. And what it meant was that I just had to find pockets of time to write, right? I had to do away with the sort of romantic notion of extended hour-long periods or week-long periods in which I'll be able to, I had some friends who would go to these residencies where like you would write in the woods for a month and they bring you lunch, and I was, I'd see it on Instagram and I'd be like, must be nice. I mean, for me, it was like if I was driving and my kids fell asleep in the car, I would pull over at the nearest CVS or the nearest Starbucks and like try to get close enough to connect to their Wi-Fi or use my hotspot. I brought my laptop with me everywhere. I bring a notebook with me most places. This was, pre-pandemic. But I mean, there's no single way that it they are constructed. I mean, for the poems, a lot of the times they're often written. There's a first draft that's written sometimes in one sitting, and then sometimes over many sittings, and then they experience just many different iterations. A lot of times, for my collection of poetry, for this, I wrote a lot of them in the notes section of my iPhone. I wrote a lot of these because I wrote this when I was in Cambridge, in my first and second year at Harvard for grad school. And I had like a 30-minute walk to and from my apartment. And walking is like a very generative, like creatively and intellectually generative thing for me. It like really helps me think in ways that I didn't fully appreciate. And in fact, now, like I'm always like listening to audiobooks or podcasts or music or something. I have to remind myself sometimes that I should not turn those things on, because before I had access to those things, and before they were like so deeply embedded into my routine, I often didn't listen to anything. And like the walking would serve as a catalyst for all sorts of ideas. What I do a lot is that when I'm reading, if I see a word or a phrase that I like a lot, I write it down, either in my phone or a notebook. And that word often serves as a catalyst to the beginning of a poem, right? It's often a lot like I'll use that word and sort of build the poem around it in some ways, or build the sentence or build the paragraph around it. And I just love the way that I kind of pay attention to the way my favorite writers write. And I love the way that people use language in ways that it wasn't imagined or anticipated. Like when you say, the rain freckled the sidewalk, it's not how it's using a noun to be a verb, and just thinking about, my favorite poets are doing those sorts of things all the time. And not only my favorite poets, my favorite nonfiction writers, my favorite novelists. And so, yeah, I think I read as a writer. Like I'm always reading and thinking about like what are the sort of decisions, literary decisions and creative decisions that writers are making. And then those kind of sit with me. And then when it's time for me to write my own, they serve as a sort of jumping pad for me to then create something else.
Hi. In reference to that, the armor of advice is, I'm holding that. I'm holding it. And then also just the lost cause is lost if you're not looking. Those are things that I really like, but I also wanted to I just needed to say that real quick. I kind of grabbed that because I want to read some of the prompts on the chat. When do you decide to write a poem as opposed to an essay or fiction or something else? And we have another treasure, Ariel's Sacrifice from the Dad poem. Somebody really enjoyed. There's like those little nuggets, and that sounds like what you're aiming for. So, so about that, the write a poem as opposed to essay or fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to write something in, like have a book or a work in every genre. My first book is a collection of poetry. This book would be a nonfiction book. Kind of have the seeds of an idea of a novel that I'm thinking about right now. I mean, the writers and thinkers that I most admire are people who have never been confined by genre or limited by discipline, and who are guided by their curiosity. And that's kind of how I think about it. Like, what is the thing I'm trying to explore, and what is the medium or the genre or the form that best allows for what to me feels like the most meaningful and robust sort of interrogation or exploration. And what I love about poems is that they allow you to ask questions without having to come up with an answer. It allows for exploration in a way that, I'll often begin a poem with a question and end it with to more questions, right? Whereas like sometimes you write an essay, sometimes something I write for the Atlantic, you know, I have a very strong idea of what I'm trying to say or what I'm trying to convince the reader of, or a specific point that I'm trying to make. And sometimes I don't know. And sometimes that lack of knowing, it's better served in a, not always, but sometimes in a poem. With fiction is is a place where I mean, you really like build a world. And I think it allows, the thing that interests me most about fiction and what I'm thinking about in the sort of early stages of the project I'm imagining is the way that it really allows for the opportunity to present like real complexity and messiness in people, and how there's no like good and evil, and it's like all of us are this sort of mess of a body, mess of an identity, and we do not, nor do anyone in our lives, fit neatly into any sort of like specifically tightly or neatly demarcated conception of like right and wrong and good and bad and evil and just, and that there's a lot of everything sort of bundled up in us. And then, you know, with an essay or with this nonfiction project, part of what I wanted to do was, it just allows more room to breathe, right? Like part of what I love and what I hope this book is something that brings together, you know, I exist and have a foot in like multiple worlds. Like I'm a poet, I'm also a journalist, I'm also trained as a sociologist, and I also have a deep interest in history. And so I wanted to sort of bring all of those different things together to create a book that blended history and memoir and sort of poetry and novelistic conceits, to make what I hope will be a dynamic, something that takes the best of the history that I've read, and the scholarship that I've read, and presents it in a way that gives it sensory detail, that gives it emotional, human and emotional texture. So we'll see. It remains to be seen whether it's successful or not. Fingers crossed. But yeah, I think, and sometimes it doesn't reveal itself until later. So for example, the book, as I said, began as that poem. And so it started as the poem, and then that poem turned into a short essay. And then that short essay turned into a longer essay, which turned into a book. And so sometimes there's a process of evolution within the genre as well.
Like a deep dive.
Hi.
Exploring. Yeah, we've got a question.
I've got a question
Yeah.
as well, please. Hi, Clint, thank you so much. My name is Rachel, and I was hoping that you could maybe talk a little bit. I have a two-part question, please. How have you been able to address the issue of systemic racial inequality in a way that is appropriate with your young children? And then to what extent do you talk about current events with your kids? Thanks.
Yep. Sounds like the fire alarm is going off in my house. I think we have a very sensitive smoke alarm. I think my wife is. Can you all hear that?
Yeah, it's fine.
Is it like if it's too piercing, I'll mute it and then try to figure out.
I think all the parents are used to the chaos.
You're just like, now somebody's gonna get up. They'll probably, you know, it's all sorts of stuff. But there couldn't be a better audience to understand how the nature of the circumstances. So as the fire alarm goes off in my house, how do I explain to my children systemic racism in a way that is scaffolding I think what you do is scaffold the conversation, right? I think what you do is in the same way that like a teacher, you don't immediately say, here's the book, now it's time to read, 4-year-old, right? Like instead, there's a process by which you slowly move a young person into, you know, identifying letters, and then phonics, and then like short sentences and simple words, and then more complex sentences. And I think that talking to your children about race and racism is the same thing. And it's interesting because sometimes race is one of the things we feel like we can't talk about with our children until they're like much, much older, in ways that we don't necessarily do with other things in the world, right? So, you know, when you're talking to your 5-year-old or your 4-year-old, you don't say, well, climate change is an existential threat to humanity, and if it goes above 3 degrees, then all the polar bears are going to die, and the beluga whale will suffocate, and Bangladesh will cease to exist as a country. No, that would be, you wouldn't tell your 4-year-old that, and you wouldn't, I don't, you know, you almost wouldn't tell a 4-year-old that. It's a lot. But what you say is, it's important to turn the water off when you're not using the faucet. It's important to recycle. It's important to make sure that we're turning the light off when we leave the room. It's important, and you make the conversation about climate change in a way that is age appropriate. And as they get older, you sort of build up different layers of appropriateness for the nature of that conversation. And with race, it's the same thing. You don't go around and saying like white supremacy is embedded in the American project and has been since 1619 and is entangled in every facet of American social, political, and economic life, and will doom the republic so that we, you know, fall into an existential crisis. What you say is, you know, there are people who come from different places, and we don't have to pretend that, you know, I think a thing that you can do with your young child early is like help them reject notions of colorblindness, right? Like I think part of what parents often do, say like, it doesn't matter if you're black or brown or white or purple, and it's, you know, it's well intentioned, and it's not, people are not doing something I think so wrong with it. But I think what is a different way to frame that is to say, yeah, that person in your class has this complexion skin and comes from this place, and like, how that's amazing. How amazing is it that you get to like share space and learn from and be and experience their culture, and so thinking about not the ways that you cannot erase someone's identity in order to have conversations with your child about equity, but instead frame it as like, well, yes, we are all different, and that difference is this beautiful, remarkable, incredible thing that we should celebrate and lift up, rather than pretend as if it doesn't exist. And as children get older, you know, I mean, my kids didn't watch, I mean, they're 2 and 3.5, and so they're not aware of anything that happened last week. And, you know, to the extent that like they're aware of current events, you know, my 3.5-year-old MSNBC was on, and he walked up, and there was a picture of Trump at the bottom, and there was a picture of Joe Biden, and he was like, that's the next president, and that's the sad man. And I was like, that's it. That's all you got to know. And you know, I mean, because even those kind of things, we try to frame it as like, instead of like, this is a bad person, or, you know, it's like, sometimes people do bad things or say bad things because bad things have happened to them. And, you know, I mean, it's like getting deeper into it, but I think, you know, you're careful, and you want to first and foremost protect their well-being. But I think there are ways to do that also sort of gently put them in the shallow end of these conversations. You don't have to like throw somebody into deep end and tell them to swim. You can just help them get their feet wet, and as they get more comfortable and you get more comfortable, you sort of walk your way into deeper water.
We do have some people that are going to ask questions. I just wanted to go back. Hold on just a second. Jose, that you asked, what do you wish your children's I'm reading this wrong. What do you wish your children's white friends' parents taught them about race in the U.S.? Did that answer your question, Jose? That what Clint was just saying? I just want to just double check with you.
I think maybe, you know, I don't know how old his kids are, but, you know, as you look at more of like the structure, like how do you explain the structure? Because, you know, there's racist people and then there's racist structures, and like, how do you separate the two, but, you know, kind of tie them together at the same time?
Hold on 1 second. Give me 1 second. I'll be right back. I just got to tell my wife that this thing, because the alarm went off. This is such a Zoom thing. It's like, I'll be right back in 1 minute.
No worries.
But I do want to say that this is the first Zoom that I've seen somebody at a fire pit during the Zoom. So I'm thinking you might be winning Zoom right now. so
Can I mention something? Because it seems like most people on the call are white parents. My name's Nicole. I'm an older parent. I have 2 teenagers. And the question that just came up, my kids are 14 and 16. We've been talking about race since they were little kids. And I had to get comfortable and learn about what it was to be white. I get comfortable like referring to myself as a white person because I'm in my 50s, I'm outing myself, but I was taught it's not polite to talk about color, right? Like if you were a good non-racist person, you never labeled, you never did that. And so it was all around. So part of it I would say is like you as a white person, parent, you need to get comfortable and educate yourself, like really educate yourself and kind of look at the ugly parts that you've picked up without knowing because you bathe in this culture and you breathe this air, that you have to do that. And there are ways, every woman on this call has probably had their own talk about the things that you have to do to stay safe in America. That's a moment for you to use empathy and think about if I had to explain that. So, books like Waking Up White or The Backpack or things that you can use to deepen your understanding and your empathy can help you when your kids are little with those conversations. That's all I would say. And by the time that they're teenagers, based on the feedback I get from people, you can actually have like kids who are really aware, like see it, and that's all I would say. Sorry that I took
that's right.
advantage of you taking a break to
No,
speak
Nicole,
about white,
Yeah, and I think it's important because some of the questions, Nicole, are about that. Where do we go next? And I think that that's where we go. And so we'll hand it back over. Clint, you're back.
So the question was, how do you teach them about the structures and the system? I mean, part of it is what I said before, but part of it I think is the way that part of what this country does is like in ways that are both subtle and explicit, inundate people with messages that it's like the myth of meritocracy, right? Like the reason that one part of DC looks one way and another part of DC looks another way, the reason one part of New York looks one way and another part of New York looks another way, the reason one part of Maryland looks one way and another part of Maryland looks another way is because of the message is that it is because of the people in those communities and what they have done or failed to do, rather than what has been done to those communities generation after generation after generation, right? And part of what I think all the time about is a 1963 essay and speech by James Baldwin called A Talk to Teachers, in which he talks about how the role of the teacher of the Black child is to communicate to them that although that child has been inundated their entire lives with the idea that they are criminal, there is something wrong with them, that they are responsible for the conditions that they live in, and it is their fault that they live in these conditions, and if they want to change something, then it is singularly up to them. And he's like, your job is to convince the child that they are not the criminal, but it is in fact the society that has created the conditions that this child has been born into, that they are the criminal, right? That society is the criminal, right? And that the society creates the criminal conditions in which so many young people have to grow up in spaces saturated with violence and poverty. Part of what I think about all the time, and like if I had like a main thesis of how I move through the world, it is that but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, I very easily could have been in a very different set of positions, right? Like one of my advisors on my dissertation was a political philosopher and specialized in sort of Rawlsian notions of justice. And so I think a lot about John Rawls and the veil of ignorance. And it's this idea that what sort of society would you want to live in if you had no control over, you didn't know what country you'd be born into, you didn't know what race you would be born, you didn't know what gender, you didn't know what sex, what sexual orientation, what year, what home, like what sort of society would you want if as is the case, if it were all up to chance, right? Like if somebody you was just kind of rolling the dice and you see where you end up, you would want to build, I imagine, and what Rawls imagined is you would want to build a society in which no matter who you were born to or what sort of conditions you were born to or what people you were born to, that you would be able to achieve a level of you would be able to live a good life, a life of happiness and a life of in which you were not destitute. And I think that that's part of what I try to teach my kids now, or at least my 3.5-year-old who's able to sort of understand it. Like I'll always remember a time when I was young. I don't even remember what age. And this is New Orleans in the 90s. And so like the projects and the public housing was like a really huge part of the sort of landscape and the infrastructure. And I remember one time I was like, I was looked over through the car and was like, why did they, and I was like, why did they live like that? Or something like that. And my dad pulled the car over and he was like, Clint, like using what I think is similar language, like, but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, that very easily could have been you. Those people have done nothing to deserve that. They have been born into and live in a society that has failed them over and over and over again, right? And so just like little things, and that stayed with me for the rest of my life, right? Like even, I think helping our children understand that the reason certain communities are disproportionately living in poverty, or certain communities disproportionately live in certain types of housing, or when they start to notice inequalities that exist, being able to explain to them that those inequalities exist because of a larger history. Like you don't have to go into the nuances of the New Deal with your 7-year-old, but what you can do is say, it's important to know that like these people, or certain communities, people aren't poor just because they don't work hard, or people don't live in the same sort of house you do just because they're lazy, or people don't, and that reminding them that they are fortunate and they are lucky. And that doesn't mean that you didn't work hard. It doesn't mean their parents didn't work hard. It doesn't mean that they are not worthy of the sort of life that you are able to be a part of. But it is to push back against this often implicit notion of like moral desert, right? And this idea that unless a kid is told otherwise, they assume that the reason that they live the way they do, if they grow up in a middle or upper middle class or wealthy home, is because like their parents did the right things and they've done the right things. And I think to the extent that we can problematize and provide a sort of complexity to that formulation, our children will really benefit from it. Like if kids grow up and say like, I'm very lucky to have the things that I do. And part of how I want to move through the world is to ensure that like someone doesn't have to be lucky in order to have a roof over their head, or to have food on the table, or to like get a good education. And unfortunately, that is the reality that exists today. So if we can just help, I think that for me is the biggest thing, because it also, in the Venn diagram of race and class and demographics, helping people understand that the conditions of communities and of groups of people and of certain places are not singularly due to anything that group has done or not done, but it has instead tied to a much larger set of forces, is really important.
And then I think Kuna, you had a question.
Rachel actually asked my question, but
okay.
I do want to take a moment just to say hi, neighbor, and that we're currently enrolling. I know you have young children, and also just to sympathize with your wife, because my husband is also an Arsenal fan. But thank you for this. And my question was really around the mess of identity and bringing it up with the young children. I think, you see a lot of white women here, but we all kind of have different racial dynamics within our own homes, and a lot of sensitivity to how to raise our children. So your thoughts on that issue have been really helpful. I think we're all kind of trying to get as many points of view as possible. So thank you.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll say is that, like, for me, it is important to recognize someone made the point previously. It might have been I'm scrolling over Nicole. I might have, but someone made the point that, like women, for example, and young girls are often, they have their own version of the talk, right? That, like, parents have to tell young women, like, about, how the implications of the things you wear, but, like, how do you communicate to a young person that, like, you should be able to wear what you want, and you can wear what you want, but what might happen, but that's because of a larger set of, like, sexist and patriarchal forces, and that same sort of balancing act where you want to protect your child and you also want to make sure the child knows that shouldn't be the case, right? Like, what you wear has nothing to do with should have nothing to do with whether somebody comes up to you or says something to you, because it is your body and it is your choice. And how do you communicate that in a way that also gives them a sense of, like, the realities of the world? And I say that because part of what I think about all the time are the intersection of my own identities, right? And the way that I exist in a body that is both oppressed and has historically done the oppressing, right? So as a Black man, I am a person who is part of a group of people whose ancestors were enslaved and have been systemically, intergenerationally oppressed in every way one can imagine. I am also a cisgendered straight man, and I benefit from forces of sexism. I benefit from forces of patriarchy. I benefit from homophobia, not in an ethical way, but, like, the way that the systems and this world are built, it creates opportunities and creates space for me that it does not create for someone who is queer, or for someone who is a woman, or for someone who is moving through the world with a different set of gender or sexual orientation identities. And so this is why, like, I mean, it's almost, the word is almost like a mockery of itself now, and I kind of hate it, but, like, woke, right? Because now it's been, like, weaponized and, in bad faith in all sorts of ways. But, like, when it wasn't previously, when it was like, woke, like, what is woke? And I didn't like it even before the bad faith conceptions of it, because it suggested that it was this, like, threshold that you cross, right? Like, you weren't woke and now you're woke, rather than it being this ongoing process that you engage in every day, right? So every single day I wake up and I have to work actively to be anti-sexist. I have to work actively to be anti-homophobic. I have to work actively to be anti-transphobic. I have to work actively to be anti-racist, right? Like, it is ongoing work that all of us have to do in each sort of part of who we are. And the thing is that it often means that we will, to build the sort of world that I want, and to build a world that is more just and equitable, it will mean that in some ways, in some different facets of my identity, that I will be giving something up. But even the formulation of giving it up is incorrect, because it never belonged to me in the first place, right? So if I want a world, in which, like, there is no structural or interpersonal sexism, and that patriarchy is not an animating feature of the workplace, of interpersonal dynamic, like romantic dynamics, of any of these things, then one should recognize that, like, you are, in a sense, creating lessening sets of opportunities that might exist for you than might have previously, right? Because of the sort of inequities that currently exist. An example I think about all the time is there's a study done by sociologist Diva Pager, who the late Diva Pager, who passed only a few years ago, and it was this resume study. And essentially, you had, some of you probably have heard of it, like, you had the exact same resume, and you put a Black sounding name at the top of one and a white sounding name at the top of the other. So let's say Jamal and Tommy. And so you send these resumes out, and what they found is that even though they are the exact same resume, Tommy was 50% more likely to get a call back for an interview than Jamal was, right? So if you go to Tommy, Tommy's a thoughtful, progressive parent in Tacoma Park, and you're like, Tommy, like, this is what happened, because just because people assume that you're white, you are 50% more likely to get a call back for this interview than Jamal. Like, what do you think about that? Tommy's gonna be like, this is wrong. I would never accept that. Like, this, I don't want to live in a world like that. No, like, that has to end. And then if you're like, okay, cool. Well, in order to build the sort of society that is more just and the sort of society you claim to want, you're going to be 25% less likely to have get a call back for this interview than you were previously, meaning that you might not get this job that you otherwise would have gotten. Then Tommy might be like, oh, I don't know about this. Like, that's reverse racism. This is affirmative action, right? Because it is, one sees it as something being taken from them, when it is in fact the sort of redistribution of opportunity as it always should have been. And so, and that exists in all of these different, whether it's sexism, whether it's patriarchy, whether it's homophobia, whether it's nationality, all of these different things. Part of it is reframing for ourselves that it is giving up or something being taken away, rather than moving toward what it should have always been. I think I have time for one more question.
Yeah, I was going to say that some people, I think that Stephanie and Rebecca, your questions are answered a little bit. Maybe we can talk about it some more when Clint's done. But the one is, I hope this is a good one, because is the armor advice. How does your armor of advice differ from the one your parents gave you? How is it the same?
Sorry, Leslie, before we do that, I just wanted to make a comment. This is Yasmin. Hi.
Yeah. Hey.
Thanks for coming to talk to us. I think that the framing of structural inequities as luck and privilege is really problematic, because it really reinforces this idea that in order to actually make things equitable, people are giving something up, instead of the fact that, like, they have it because other people lack it. And the reason that other people lack it is because it was taken away from them in order to reward white people. And, like, the brutality of enslavement, the brutality of capitalism, the brutality of our system, our history, every single thing that has happened for the last more than 500 years has been to the benefit of white people, especially white people who are living in America. So to say, like, wow, white kid, you're so lucky that you have all these things, I think that it can, especially if it's not happening in the context where lots of conversations about race and structural oppressions and marginalized communities are happening often, the unfortunate kind of side effect of that is often that sense of, like, that you are lucky because somehow you still did something good and you somehow deserved it more than other people, ends up kind of, it's like, it ends up coloring the way that people look at it. So I just wanted to offer that, because I think that, especially as we are a majority white community with almost, vast majority of the families and children who go to our school are white and are not children of color, it's really important to consider that when we're talking about this.
Thank you. That was good. And then we'll go back over. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I mean, I apologize if that wasn't clear or something else came across. I mean, any notion of luck has to be contextualized in the sort of broader structural framework of inequality. And I think that when we think about the notion of again, the sort of arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, that arbitrariness is inherently tied to a history of oppression, that arbitrariness is deeply entangled in things that are not coincidence, but rather are created by design. Yeah, I mean, certainly, I don't think any notion of, like, it can't exist singularly as, like, you are lucky and this person is unlucky, because that absolves folks of an impetus to like interrogate the very notion of, like, where luck stems from and where it doesn't. So
I want to just chime in that I think that like the conversation around luck is really a conversation around challenging the notion of getting to where you are because you earned it. Because for most people who are where they are, if they are in the, you know, middle or upper class, it is not a matter of earning, but a matter of being able to to the status that they're in. Right. Yeah.
What was the last question? Sorry.
For the armor of advice differ, and how is it the same?
How is the armor of advice that I give my children different from, I mean, part of my kids are so young, so part of it is I'm still learning what sort of armor they need and when to give it to them. I mean, I think that I think what is different is that when these conversations were had with me, they weren't framed in a sort of intersectional way. Like we kind of had conversations around sexism. We definitely didn't really have a lot of conversations about like homophobia, and you know, I guess because I was born in '88, and that the nature of those conversations looked different across society than they do now. And you know, everything was kind of just like, just treat everybody the same and make sure you're like kind to everyone, without really delving into the specific sorts of harm that people, and the layers of harm and the layers of oppression that one might experience because of the compounding impact of the various identities that they might hold. So part of, you know, making very clear to my children, even beyond their own identity, right? Like just the way that we talk about, like, what does it mean for people to have like two daddies or two mommies, or and just like trying to do my best to push back against any notion of like or any inkling of what should be and what shouldn't be, right? Part of what I noticed with my kid is, and it's so interesting because, you know, all of the stuff you get, like you get the puzzle, and like it's Old MacDonald had a farm puzzle, and here's Old MacDonald and here's his wife. And so my son, you know, was like, oh, like boys are farmers and girls aren't, right? Like, cause that's what he sees. And so being very intentional about the sort of like the layered conversations around those things is something that, and being like, no, like girls can be farmers, boys can be princesses, you know, whatever, you know, and just like in ways that like those conversations didn't happen with me. And my parents didn't do anything wrong. It just was a different moment. And I think we are trying our best to be as intentional as possible in ensuring that our children do not consume or come to believe in any sort of standardized notion of like traditional or normality or more, even more specific, like supposedness, right? Like that this thing is supposed to be like this, and trying to really expand their imaginations and their understanding of like what the world should look like. So that's like that the armor I'm trying to give my children is in some ways the armor of imagining beyond the world that they can often be inundated with, and saying like, you know, this cartoon might have said this, but like that's not actually true, or like why do you think that is, and really trying to open up space for conversations around these things. So yeah, trying to give them the armor beyond thinking about their racial identity, but thinking about the identities of people beyond them. well, this has been wonderful. Thank you all so much. And yeah, I wish we could have been together in person. And I appreciate all of you sticking around. And so many of you stuck around for like the whole time. Usually people they bounce after the talk and they're like, oh, I gotta go during the Q&A. But truly, thank you all. I appreciate it. Hopefully we all can connect in person in the after times, whenever those are. And this has been a delight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Clint.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for coming too.
Thank you so much.